My name's Tony Kelleher. I'm head of the Immunovirology and Pathogenesis program at the Kirby and Senior Vice Dean Research for the Faculty of Medicine. It's a great honour and responsibility to be given this opportunity. There was no need for me to take the enthusiasm pills this morning. I want to take this opportunity to talk about David Cooper's legacy and the challenge that legacy presents us. His legacy is multifaceted, but for me, it is best summed up as an aspirational model for how to conduct clinical research. David's legacy is as a model for all of those who aspire to be a complete clinician and an impactful researcher. David pursued clinical research as a choice. He had the intellect and capacity to focus on whatever research he wished. In fact, I know firsthand that he actively contributed to and encouraged basic immunological and virological research, biostatistical, epidemiological, sociological, and implementation research. But his chosen focus was clinical research, because when the AIDS epidemic broke in this country, this is where he knew he could make the biggest difference. There was a clear, unequivocal clinical need, but there were very few answers, and none of those answers were satisfactory. It allowed him to put his patients first. His belief in health as a basic human right was at the centre of all his efforts. How did he do this? Well, firstly, he was a great clinician. He had great care and respect for his patients, and he had a terrific personal rapport with them as individuals. This was backed up by a huge, up-to-date knowledge and astounding clinical acumen, meaning that he could see the whole clinical picture in any one patient. He was able to make overarching diagnoses and a cogent, sensible management plan, often from the end of the bed. As importantly, he could communicate these plans in a compassionate, understandable way to his patients. There are many anecdotes that I could relate to illustrate this. And we, in fact, heard some of these yesterday and read some of those testimonials yesterday. But the most definitive demonstration of his clinical insight is that it formed the basis for many of his seminal observations, including the first descriptions of the primary HIV infection syndrome and the lipodystrophy syndrome, and in fact drove much of his interventional research thereafter. He knew how to set up and deliver world-class clinical care, which was exemplified by the HIV service at St Vincent's. He set up the service with the Sisters of Charity at a time where most healthcare workers and most healthcare providers did not want to deal with the disease, let alone the cahexic, damaged, isolated patients suffering from it. The service he pulled together was multidisciplinary. It had medics with different specialist disciplines, working hand in glove with nurses, allied health, and the laboratory. There was integration of in- and outpatient services, and the research culture was embedded in the place. This was a one-stop shop for patients, which used all available resources regardless of their affiliation to derive maximum effect in terms of both patient care and research output. There were no artificial silos. There was blurring around the edges of where the hospital services finished and the resources paid for by research grants started. There were minimal divides between those who were employed by the university and those who were employed by the hospital. These ideals, set up in the 80s and the 90s, are now aspirational goals for many health precincts around this country. The proponents of these modern ideas could do well to consider the model David Cooper set up in the early 80s and 90s on the St Vincent's campus. But to truly advance the care of patients, David knew that research would require connections well beyond the hospital. This required partnerships with communities, with GPs, with other hospitals, and in other countries. David built collaborative networks. This approach underpinned the research he did across his career. He built alliances locally, nationally, and internationally. These alliances sought out the expertise required. They included clinicians, laboratories, trialists, biostatisticians, and community members. He was not scared of diversity of opinion on working parties or steering groups, even though this often meant herding goats. The HIV vaccine design and development team contract awarded to him and his team by the NIH in the early 2000s was a great example of this. Gene jockeys battled for prominence with social researchers. Molecular biologists were shocked by the colloquial, sexually frank and explicit terminology used in the patient risk questionnaires, and social researchers were completely bamboozled by plasmid maps and good manufacturing practices for the vaccines. But David was across it all. Everyone's opinions were valued, and the result of the teamwork was much greater than the sum of the parts. The current partnership grant with New South Wales Health, called the Prevention Revolution, is a contemporary example with members spanning molecular biologists through to community reps, and with policymakers sitting at the table to ensure the rapid transition of any findings. He also broke the model of needing to be a medic to be a leader in clinical research. Many of the best leaders developed at the Kirby were not medically trained. And currently 5 of the 14 program heads at the Kirby are not clinicians as traditionally defined. As well as identifying expertise, he trained and mentored the next generation of clinical researchers. He identified talent, he gave that talent responsibility and support, and most importantly, gave them the trust to just get on with it, with a hands-off, soft-touch approach to management. He was, in himself, intensely loyal to these people, and his generosity and understated style of leadership generated loyalty and respect in return. To these people, he was a true role model, ideal boss, and insightful mentor. He ensured recognition and acknowledgement and the importance of teamwork. Note the group authorships on each of these premier publications. One of the oft-quoted lines about David, and we've heard it this morning already, was that he was involved with the development of every currently licensed antiretroviral. But I think far more importantly, he was involved in the design, development, and successful completion of multiple strategically, clinically critical trials that determined the best way to use these drugs and how to use these internationally across multiple jurisdictions. And these things have found their way into guidelines and into practice. He used these collaborative methods to ask and answer the seemingly simple but big important questions that changed the way HIV was treated, and to make sure that the positive findings were translated into policy and then implemented. Part of his legacy is enshrined in the current antiretroviral guidelines worldwide. And while he played a leadership role in these networks, he was also an advocate. In the 80s and 90s, he was a driver of the reformation of the way clinical trials are conducted in this country that still today allow more rapid access to drugs through the clinical trials approval program that he helped implement. He had shown leadership and advocacy as a member of global guidelines committees and as president of IAS, when that organisation was still nascent. His contribution to IAS was to focus it on the regions where the burden of disease was greatest and the investment and knowledge was the least. And this culminated in Durban hosting the World AIDS Conference in 2000. However, even prior, he was acting on his belief that we should be confronting the problems in our region. In 1996, with Joop Lange and Prapan Panapanak, he set up HivNat in Bangkok. This started small. This trio bullied pharma into giving them money to set it up. It is now a fully independent, highly respected research institute deriving funding from multiple sources, including the NIH in the USA. And Professor Prapan will tell us more about this shortly. He has encouraged the network to, he's encouraged the Kirby to work with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander populations, prisoners, and expanded our work throughout the region in PNG, Indonesia, the Pacific Islands, Cambodia, and most recently, Myanmar. The intent of this research has always been to ensure the best evidence-based treatment regimes are available to patients in deprived, underserviced populations. David never rested on his laurels. In 2017, he completed a strategic plan for the Kirby to grow it from its historical strengths in HIV, hepatitis C and STIs, and extend it to other challenging infections, such as neglected tropical diseases, human papillomavirus infections, and tuberculosis, and had gained the support of the Vice-Chancellor of this university to pursue this course. So what is David's legacy? It includes, but is not restricted to, a patient-centred approach to research. A collaborative, multidisciplinary, inclusive model for performing clinical research, complete with networks of researchers, clinicians, and communities in which to do this research, and links to policymakers to make sure these findings have the best chance of rapid implementation. And a vibrant clinical research institute which focuses on asking and answering the questions that will make a difference to the most vulnerable, and to make sure these things are delivered. But his real legacy, and the legacy that we should embrace as a challenge, is to match his contribution going forward. When confronted by junior researchers and a proposal that was not completely funded, with the researcher saying, "But David, how?" David would say, "Just do it." When he was convinced that something was worth doing, he chased it. However, I'm not sure that we should be asking what would David do. I think to confront and achieve the challenge of this huge legacy, I think we need to be more on the front foot, more forthright, more determined. The critical metric of whether we should proceed with any research proposal should be the conclusion: David would do it. Thank you. So we now move on to the next section of this program, which would excite David greatly. One of the things he did last year was he proposed an honorary degree for Professor Prapan Panapanak from HivNat. And that was accepted by the university last year. And he was very excited by that. And so I'd now ask Gillian Siegel, the Deputy Chancellor of the university, Rodney Phillips, the Dean of Medicine, and Professor Prapan Panapanak to join me on the stage. Thank you.